The Russians made numerous advances across the front line, with a single advance in favor of the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to advance along the border between the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions to the southwest of Kamyanka, within Kupyansk itself, along the flanks of Kościantynivka, and on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. The Russians captured Filia and managed to advance along the second line of defense. In turn, the Ukrainians managed to recapture a position to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians expanded their zone of control along the border between the Belgorod and Kharkiv region, gaining control over additional parts of the eastern flank of Vodoradne following the capture of the settlement. Russians are now just a few kilometers from gaining full control over the border area from the very western direction, in the direction of Milove, all the way to the Oskar River line. That is a wide section of the front line that will be under Russian control, from which they can stage offensive operations towards the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, and further supplying their forces along the western bank of the Oskar River line through this area. The Russians also managed to advance southwest of Kamyanka, getting control over an additional forest patch along the intersection here west of Kamyanka. Russians are developing offensive operations to gain control over the road here that connects down towards the Oreshanske and then up towards Uluhivka. This is to gain control over the area between Vodoradne and Krasnopershe, gain control over this wide section of the front line, and the road connecting from the Russian side of the border down towards Krasnopershe will strengthen the Russian offensive capacity on the eastern flank of this settlement line along the road here, which is acting as the forward positions of the Ukrainians here along the border section between the Kharkiv and Belgorod region. Gain control over this entire section of the front line will allow the Russians to start fighting over the defensive lines of the Ukrainians and threaten the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of the highway that connects to Vovchansk. As for Kupyansk itself, the Russians continued offensive operations within the encircled area, as they're looking to physically cut off the railway in the central parts of the town. The Russian objective is to physically cut off the apartment complex area and to gain control over the railway station. This will secure the northern parts of the railway area and then push to gain control over the southern parts along the school and then the southern apartment complex area, which will then allow them to gain control over the remaining parts where the Ukrainians will be pushed to the edges of it. From there, the Russians start offensive operations across the Oskar River line towards the eastern parts of Kupyansk, or down south towards Zinkove in the very south, where they can cut off the entire crossing from the Oskar River line through to the eastern parts, where Ukrainian forces are still active along the defensive lines. In the direction of Kościantynivka, the Russians have managed to advance to the northeast of Yablonivka, gaining control over additional parts of the outskirts of the settlement, where a tiny bit of the residential area remains under Ukrainian control. The majority of their positions are along the fortifications and along the reservoir itself. Russians gain control over these fortifications to the south will not have any significant impact on the battle over Kościantynivka itself. However, it will lead to the Russian forces having a strong defensive line towards the city to deal with any Ukrainian counterattacks, allowing them to concentrate their forces in the direction of Stepanivka, Dovhabelka, Roskishne, and then upwards towards Mykolaiv here on the western flank of the city, to gain control over the sub-routes into Kościantynivka, which can be used if the Russians gain control over the northern flank, and also to secure the southern flank for any strikes on the highway supplying Kościantynivka through the Sloviansk-Kościantynivka line. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians made two advances. On the eastern flank of Sofiivka, the Russians have now reached the outskirts of the settlement, and in the northern direction they've managed to cut off the road here, connecting Sofiivka with the Stepanivka, Dovhabelka, and Mykolaiv Roskishne direction. This isolates the eastern and western sections of the front line for the Ukrainians, and now allows the Russians to start developing offensive operations towards Sofiivka, cutting off the supplies going through Sofiivka, and with the road cut off in the northwestern direction through Shahove, the Russians could operationally encircle the Ukrainian positions within Shahove and Volodymyrivka, as they currently threaten to storm the settlements directly and gain control over both of which will significantly strengthen the logistics of the Russian forces in the area. Russians gain control of Shahove will allow them access to the road in the northwestern direction towards Kutyrev Yar, allowing for additional roads connecting to the frontline positions, strengthening the offensive capabilities within the pocket which was previously operational encircled by the Ukrainians. Further north, gaining control over Sofievka will allow additional supply lines connected to their forces across the river line, and this will significantly bolster the Russian offensive capabilities on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. This will also allow the Russians, through their supply lines going through Novokonymishne and Novotvoretsk, to go in the southern direction towards Rodinsk for the storming of the city. The Russians also managed to gain control over the forest lines here to the northeast of Novotvoretsk, fully securing the northeastern flank of it, and now fighting continues over the fortifications on the eastern flank of Volodymyrivka as they storm the town itself. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over the town of Novomykolivka. The Ukrainians launched their counterattacks through the Solona River line with the hourglass formation on the eastern flank. They had defensive positions towards the Russian frontline positions, and with some crossings across the Solona River, they managed to gain a foothold within the settlement. The Russians responded by striking their positions with artillery and FAB bombs. However, the Ukrainians were able to move and rotate a lot. With additional forces arriving, they were able to gain control over Novomykolivka, which slightly complicates their supplies towards Moravka and gives the Ukrainians the opportunity to flank their positions by attacking from the northern and western directions, with the hourglass formation to the west and hourglass formation to the north as their basis of operation. The Russians, in turn, will be focusing on regaining control of Novomykolivka by gaining control over the river line, establishing the positions alongside it, and the current operations to storm the settlement of Molodetsk here on the western flank of Odashne and the coal mine area in the northern flank, which will free up their forces for offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region, which will cut off the supplies going to the hourglass formation at Novomykolivka. To the southwest of this, the Russians managed to gain full control over Filia and the surrounding forest lines and forest patches. The Russians are here working to gain control over the defensive line, which is situated between Horhova in the east and Filia to the west. With control over both flanks, the Russians will look to connect their forces on both sides to cut off the Ukrainians operating within the northern parts of Dashne along the fortifications and in the forest lines and forest patches leading up to it. Gaining full control over this entire section through the defensive line will allow the Russians to start developing offensive operations towards Novopavlivka. And with the capture of Borovka, the Russians are able to gain control over the fortifications in the northern and western flanks of Moravka. They'll be able to start pushing in the direction of Novopavlivka from the eastern flank, as well as from Horhova in the east, Filia in the west, and Dashne in the south, to allow the Russians to launch operations in multiple directions. And with fighting over Ivanivka, the Russians can also develop offensive operations from the western flank as well. In the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region along the border between the two, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional forest lines here north of Novogorivka following the capture of the settlement. The Russians here continue developments in between the first and second lines of defense along the Yanchur River here in between Verbova in the north and Novovasilivka in the south. The Russian objective is to gain control over the positions on the eastern bank of the river line, strengthening the offensive capacity across the river line by concentrating their forces in one of these directions and finding weak spots in the Ukrainian defenses. Also to develop offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense to gain control over the roads leading up to the highway area and isolate Huliaipole and start battle over Huliaipole, mainly from the northern flank. Taking a wider look at the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhzhia region, we can see that the defensive fortifications are centered in a straight line from the Dnieper River all the way into the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. The Russians bypassed this following the capture of Uladar towards Velika Novosilka, following the capture of that settlement up towards Komar and the river line along the Vovcha river line. This allowed them to gain control over the flanks of these fortifications and start storming them. Since then, it has been a rapid capture of these fortifications bit by bit, where the Ukrainians are now reporting that the Russians are sending reinforcements to the first and second lines of defense to speed up the capture of the fortifications and strengthen their ability to capture the next fortifications after the next. As currently the Russian forces have been spread thinly from the start to the end of the current holdings of fortifications, with additional reinforcements coming in, they'll be able to properly consolidate their positions and strengthen their offensive capabilities beyond it. The Russian capture of these fortifications through the flanking of it is a significant development that is very much in favor of the Russians, as it allows them to not storm the fortifications directly head on, which would prove a major hindrance of their objective to gain full control over the Zaporizhia region, which is one of their war goals. The Russians bypassing these fortifications, gaining control over the rear of it, gaining control over Huliaipole that acts as a logistical hub, will allow them to push into the Dnipropetrovsk region, which can then capture Pokrovsk, which will act as an additional logistical hub, which also flanks the fortified positions along the road connecting directly to the city of Donetsk. Getting control over the crossing here will have a direct road connecting from Donetsk here in the east to Pokrovsk in the west, which will further strengthen the logistics of the Russian forces through this highway towards Pokrovsk, and then onwards towards the next large town along the highways. And offensive operations will continue with the highways as the concentration of the forces and completely bypassing the fortifications. The Ukrainians are preparing for this by building fortifications on the eastern and northern flanks of the city, which will allow them to create additional lines of defense close to the city itself, but they would lose control over the majority of the Zaporizhia region and the first and second lines of defense, which they had spent years and a lot of money and resources to build. Even if the Ukrainians are able to properly build fortifications on the outskirts of the city to prevent a Russian siege of it, the Russians will be able to bypass the city itself and move in the northern direction towards the city of Dnipro, towards Pavlograd, and towards the flank of the Kharkiv region and into the Poltava region as well. The Russians would be able to bypass the main defensive lines of the Ukrainians and gain control over positions deep within Ukrainian territory, through which, in a potential negotiated end of the war, the Russians would be able to exchange territories within the Dnipro, Poltava, or Kharkiv region for possessions in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. And if they're able to gain full control over the Donetsk region, then the leverage in the negotiations become much more significant for a negotiated peace. So what we're seeing is that the Russians continue offensive operations along the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions as the main areas of offensive operations, but they're also spreading into the Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv regions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.